Good morning. Thank you all for coming today to this briefing on the OECD's inventory on support to fossil fuels. We're going to have a multiple presentation this morning. The Secretary General will begin, followed by Johan Sauvage from the OECD's Trade Directorate, and then we'll take your questions. Thank you very much. Secretary General.
Today, in the Financial Times, in the companies and market section, is companies accelerate carbon pricing, And on the right, it says Volkswagen apologizes for cheating on U.S. car exhaust emissions tests. Yesterday, I heard in just a television newscast that the fines could amount to, in the billions in terms of. So these are kinds of things that never have happened before. Nobody really was focusing on these things. Now it's a question of the little contraption which is in the car, which may signal that you are doing better, but when you're not really doing better in terms of emissions. In one brand of cars, just quite interesting, quite remarkable that the focus and the chief executive of Volkswagen goes on. And it's the awareness, the importance of the reputation of a company. This wouldn't have counted very much. It would have been a footnote a few years ago. Today, it's front page, and, Volkswagen is all over the place for the wrong reasons. And companies accelerate carbon pricing, which is fascinating because, as always, when the governments go around and around and around and around the flagpole and discussing and repeating the same arguments and, basically not taking decisions or, just procrastinating. What happens is the market starts to take over because of the pressure of society, because people are no longer willing to accommodate with a bad climate. So it was a coincidence as we are presenting this issue today. So welcome to the launch of the OECD inventory of support measures for fossil fuels of 2015. And I stress of 2015 because we have been doing this now for quite a long time. I have to say that this, of course, is something that we have been doing with and for the G20 and the G7, and we have our Sherpa here, the G20 and G7 Sherpa, Gabriela Ramos, who was one of the ones who put this forth in the work of our environmental directorate, the word our economics directorate, the word of our enterprise directorate, etc., all together in order to deliver on this, plus the work of many of our partner institutions like the IEA, plus the Nuclear Energy Agency and the International Transport Forum, and of course other organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. I may be missing one, but what I mean is that this has been in the crosshairs now for quite some time. We even divided the task. The reason why we're reporting mostly about what OECD countries do is because we keep a close watch on what all the countries do, but I'd say that because they're in the ground, the World Bank in particular has been tracking some regional development banks, some of the things that the developing countries do, which of course is where most of the big money was. Let me go into my prepared notes, and we'll perhaps take some questions later. With all eyes on a successful outcome at the COP21 in Paris this December, countries need to show they are serious about combating climate change. For a long time, the OECD has pointed to the removal of government support for fossil fuels as a potential quick win, a kind of a low-hanging fruit. Only last July, we issued a report titled Aligning Policies for a Low-Carbon Economy. To achieve, we stressed that the importance of removing such support, again for the umpteenth time, except it was very careful calculations. Frankly, we are totally schizophrenic, you know. We are trying to reduce emissions, and we subsidize the consumption of fossil fuels. And we subsidize car fleets. And we subsidize, everything that causes emissions. At some point in time, a few years ago, a country which has now strongly corrected part of its fiscal stance on the matter had more on the budget. So, developing country with many needs, more on the budget for subsidies for fossil fuels, for the consumption of fossil fuels, than for education. It was the ultimate just misallocation of resources. And also because, of course, when you subsidize across the board, those that use more benefit more, which is exactly the opposite of what you try to achieve. So it's bad for the budget, bad for the environment, and socially regressive. So, as I was saying, we launched this Aligning Policies for a Low-Carbon Economy that stresses all the things, not only that we should be doing differently or better, but the things that are wrong, just wrong, and that have this contradiction built in. The policy misalignments to achieve the goal of net zero emissions in the second half of the century. That is the goal. Net zero emissions coming from fossil fuels in the second half of the century. So today provides an opportunity to yet again take stock, at least on one of the angles, one of the works, one of the subjects on which we have to pursue this objective. This new OECD inventory puts the spotlight on almost 800 spending programs and tax breaks that governments use to encourage the production or the use of fossil fuels. These policies are found in both our member countries and in key emerging economies at national, state, and provincial levels. In addition to subsidies for consumers that often end up benefiting higher income households, they encompass official support to oil and gas companies for the exploration and exploitation of new fossil reserves. So it goes the extra step. It's very important. It's no longer just a question of analyzing the support to consumers. It's here supporting the, including the support to the producers. Interestingly, most of these policies, in fact about 2/3 of them, were introduced prior to 2000. It's important. That means inertia just keeps going and going and going. And also, those that benefit are very powerful, very important, and therefore hold on. At a time when the challenges facing policymakers were very different than what they are today. We are much less aware, 15 years ago, much less aware of what we were fighting for, about, and the nature of the enemy. In that regard, our OECD inventory reveals a great degree of policy inertia. For example, some policies benefiting consumers in the United States were introduced in response to the oil crisis of the 1970s. They're still in the books. While other policies supporting oil and gas producers came in as oil prices collapsed in the mid-'80s. And they're still in the book. And the oil has been already at $140, and they were still in the book. We don't go back and check whether all these things still make sense. And of course, those who benefit are like Johnny Walker, just keep going on, so happy. Huh? So, These policies are now obsolete. They're dangerous legacies of a bygone era when pollution was viewed as a tolerable side effect of economic growth. That is no longer the case. Therefore, they should be erased from the books. Although support for fossil fuels seems to have peaked in 2011 and 2012, global progress remains alarmingly slow. Our study finds that governments in the OECD and the BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, South Africa, collectively support fossil fuels to the tune of, let's say, up to $200 billion a year. It's dollars, $200 billion. Now, to give you some perspective, this represents, well, if you take the upper range between 160 and 200 billion, if you take the upper range of 200 billion, this is double the amount of money that we need to find every year in order to be able to comply with the Copenhagen commitment of 100 billion per year to support developing countries in order to make the transition to a low carbon economy. Just imagine, the money would come out from the fight itself. The beauty of the logic of this thing. We stop the subsidies and we get the resources that are going to be needed in order to fight the good war. We don't have to go too far. Fortunately, a number of countries have demonstrated that change is possible. Indeed, with low oil prices, the time is ripe for countries to remove consumer subsidies that can be politically so hard to withdraw. It's, I don't know if it's in a lifetime, but it looks like that, sounds like that, smells like that, and it quacks like a duck. It looks like we can actually now say, okay, because the price of oil has dropped so far, it's going to be cheaper for the consumers. You don't have to pay it with taxpayers' money. And you can allocate the taxpayers' money to education, to health, to water, to infrastructure, to housing, etc. It's a great opportunity. Or think about it the other way. People are already paying the high prices. What do you keep the high prices? Same level. But that's the other side, the side of revenue from taxes. Say, price is going to be the same. You already were paying that. Except this money is not going to be to subsidize. It's going to be to socially desirable requirements to cover. So, a lot of opportunities. Austria and the Netherlands have been among the first EU members to phase out the fuel tax concessions enjoyed by many farmers in the OECD. Mexico stopped supporting motor fuels through its floating excise tax in late 2014. And instead of actually spending about 0.5% of GDP, it was the only country that actually was spending rather than taxing emissions in the OECD at least. It will raise positive revenues about 1% of GDP in 2015. I mean, just 1.5% twist. You know how much a Minister of Finance gives for 0.2%, 0.3% of GDP to reduce the deficits? In Brussels, they're fighting about 0.2, 0.3, and they stab each other. It's imagine something that can give you 1.5 points of GDP and turn around from a deficit to a surplus. I mean, it's massive, just massive. India scrapped its subsidies for diesel fuel. That just reduced total consumer support by $8 billion between 2012 and 2014. Imagine what a country like India can do with $8 billion. Hundreds of millions of very destitute people. Imagine what you can do with $8 billion. More recently, in its revised budget for 2015, Indonesia removed gasoline subsidies, which alone were costing the government $7 billion per year. Imagine what Indonesia, with 240 million people, many of them very poor, can do with $7 billion per year. I urge other countries to follow these positive examples. The OECD stands ready to help guide and sustain fossil fuel reform efforts. This year we are releasing an additional report to our usual catalog of individual support measures. This is called the OECD Companion to the Inventory of Support Measures for Fossil Fuels 2015. Of course, the inventory is now well known to you. It's in a link, and it's a big fat book. We want to be environmentally sound, and it's floating in there in the ether. But of course, one can turn it into paper if you want. Just make sure it's recycled paper. So let me say this new report goes beyond descriptions of methodology. Goes beyond the data sources. It discusses the policy context for existing fossil fuel subsidies. It provides summary results, and it provides recommendations. It's good reading. Sometimes you laugh. Sometimes you want to pull your hair out. Sometimes you say, my God, we are really crazy. Because you see a collection of measures through which effectively we are promoting emissions, while the stated intention of mankind is to fight emissions. Take our publication, Aligning Policies Towards a Transition to a Low-Carbon Economy. Take this one, take them together. This is kind of an update also. Take a look at just the policy implications, They're very rich. Plus the usual inventory, including the arithmetic, the comparisons, the benchmarkings, etc. Let me make, before I finish here, let me make a clarification. We've been putting out numbers about subsidies on fossil fuels of different kinds. Some people talk about trillions, but I'm not going to go there. Let's just say we have been using a number of about half a trillion, 500 billion. That included, the subsidies of everybody. And that included, of course, also our own, the OECD, but the ones in Russia and the ones in Mexico and the ones in China and the ones in India and the ones in Indonesia and everybody else. This is something we have been discussing at the G20. And at the G20, there was a commitment to phase out these subsidies. It wasn't a kind of a hard, in terms of saying, Big Brother is watching and we're going to, but basically a commitment to go in the direction of reducing. There was, however, a very heated discussion as to the method of calculating the gap. Typically, for example, countries that have large reserves of coal said, don't say that there is a price gap between my price of gasoline and the market price of gasoline in the United States or elsewhere or Europe, whatever, because I use coal to generate electricity or to generate whatever, to generate heat, energy. But it's not tradable. It means I could not take the coal, this particular coal, and sell it elsewhere. So I can only use it here in order to generate, electricity. So when you look at the price of electricity, it is not that I am subsidizing it in the traditional sense of the word. It is that I have the reserves in here. I could put it. So big discussions. And of course, some other members said, no, you have to use a price gap. A price gap. How much does it cost here? How much does it cost here? The difference is the 500 billion. So, in fact, we've gone regardless of the price gaps, we've gone into the actual, measurement of how this looks in the national accounts and how this looks in the books of the companies and how money real money flowing. And we think it's 200 billion now. That means that maybe a shadow higher cost. Should things be done in another way? And maybe the shadow of a shadow of a shadow, which some institutions, as I said, are calculated into just absolutely huge, mind-boggling numbers, which then you lose kind of contact with this thing and the meaning of it. It's basically so simple as saying, don't make cheaper and more attractive and easier to consume something that you think socially should not be produced because it's hazardous for the health of mankind. Simple as that. So we are exposing the contradiction, but also trying to measure. So we come out at 200 billion. Now, 200 billion is probably pretty close to what the Common Agricultural Policy is cost today. So, we're talking very, very large numbers indeed. But this is because some of you may be the 200 billion, the 500 billion, the trillions, or whatever you have in mind, and then it becomes a little confusing. But, even if you use a lower number, it's still a massive number, but also it gives the wrong policy signals. It gives the wrong policy orientation. Now, we have a massive database. We've had it been building it up for many years. This companion report allows us to continue to play a very central role in monitoring the progress towards reform. But we're not a lone voice in advocating the reform of fossil fuel subsidies. As I said before, the International Energy Agency, our sister agency, has for years been an important ally, providing estimates of the magnitude of subsidies in the Middle East, for example, in other emerging and developing economies. We're also supporting the commitments that the G20 and the APEC leaders made in 2009. As I said, they said in 2009, we're going to phase out. It's written in there, They made a public commitment. Fossil fuels subsidies. And then I have to say, we present it mostly as a kind of a fiscal thing. Say, help the poor. Clearly, it has massive implications also. Help the planet. Help the budget. Dear friends, this release represents a major step towards better transparency and accountability. It shows just how much of taxpayers' money is helping to sustain our dependence on fossil fuels. The OECD is dedicated to assisting countries in their efforts to reform fossil fuel subsidies to deliver better policies for better lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary General. Just a brief technical presentation of the inventory now from Jehan Sauvage, and then we'll take your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Ladies and gentlemen, I will just take a few minutes of your time to present the main findings of our report in a visual manner. Let me first start with the why question. So as the Secretary General emphasized, the reform of fossil fuel subsidies offers a good opportunity for a quick win on the climate front. The latest IPCC's assessment report shows that the combustion of fossil fuels alone has been the major contributor to man-made CO2 emissions, as you can see here. So there's no question that this can really help put dents into our global CO2 emissions. On top of that, fossil fuel subsidies are also quite harmful locally, since they may encourage the emission of pollutants that are really harmful for human health and the environment. They're also costly, as the Secretary General emphasized, representing big amounts of money at the expense of taxpayers, of course, and this at a time when many governments are struggling to reduce their public deficits and debts. finally, they're also quite distorting, and they encourage the inefficient production and use of energy economy-wide. So what we did here at the OECD to help get a better understanding of the scope and magnitudes of these fossil fuel subsidies is to put together this inventory, which now covers 40 countries. Back in 2012, the first inventory only covered 24 countries. We're now here with 40 countries, of which 34 are the OECD members, 34 OECD countries, and 6 large emerging economies, the BRICS. Together, this group of countries, together, this group of countries accounts for about 80% of global energy use. That's a big amount, a big chunk of the pie. What's also very notable here, that's not just a marginal aspect of it, it's a very core aspect, is that the inventory covers subnational policies in the case of federations. We're talking about all Australian states, all German Länder, a big number of US states. Why this matters? It's because we found that sometimes something happens at a subnational level that runs counter to what's happening at the federal level. So you really need to pay attention to this to see that policies all go the same way.
This is part of the contradictions, you know, that mostly we deal with national policies, and sometimes the problems are at the regional, state, and even municipal.
So together, this makes the OECD, we think, a unique source of information, and one in which there is a great level of detail. There's actually a lot of information identifying and documenting almost 800 individual measures with a great deal of information about who gets the money, how you get it, when the measure was introduced, the legal source for it. And this is the only database we know of that covers both production, meaning the extraction and refining of fossil fuels, and their use, whether it's in power plants, in vehicles, in dwellings, so on and so forth. Oops. So using this information, we were able to derive some summary results and indicators, leading to some key messages and conclusions. One of those is that total support remains quite high across both OECD countries and the emerging economies we cover, representing, like the Secretary General said, more than $160 billion last year. The good news is that support seems to have peaked. The bad news is that progress is too slow. Note that the observed decline of recent years is not just an artifact of lower oil prices. It's not just because the oil prices are lower that you see a decrease. There's actually genuine policy actions by a number of countries that drove this result. You can see that Mexico alone accounts for a big chunk of the recent decrease, as emphasized by the Secretary General earlier. In the case of the BRICS, India's efforts have been decisive, and we're hoping that next year support will keep going down as the government of Indonesia, removes the gasoline subsidies, which are a big chunk. Just to provide more illustration of this trend we've been observing toward lower support, Austria and Netherlands, already mentioned, removed the tax preferences for diesel fuel used by farmers. We've seen also some reforms for fuels used in railways, for instance. In Germany, a country that has been subsidizing the extraction of hard coal for decades to the tune of billions of euros every year, we're seeing a very steep decline from about 5 billion euros about 10, 15 years ago. Now the government spends less than 2 billion euros. And in accordance with EU regulations, we're expecting all support to be phased out by 2018. So that's also a big notable feature. The example of India was already mentioned, as was that of Mexico. I would also add Brazil to the list, as Brazil had some of the same features as Mexico, with an excise tax on motor fuels that was set to zero until recently, and finally started to become positive this year. So that's also a notable move that will reduce support there by billions of dollars. So a key finding from this is that countries that have taken action should continue doing so. They should persist. But they should also encourage other countries to do the same. As the Secretary General said, most measures were introduced a long time ago, so it's very good for now for countries to maybe take a look with fresh eyes at their measures and think twice about whether they still make sense We have very low inflation, low economic growth, high public debt, high deficit. So maybe now is a good time to think twice about whether these measures make sense. Time is of the essence, of course, especially in the run-up to COP21, as people are getting more aware of the challenges that climate poses. It's also very important for the OECD to track support for fossil fuels, like we have been doing for several years. And this is because oil prices won't always stay low. Actually, if and when oil prices increase again, we need to make sure that we are there to monitor support, to see whether countries revert back to their old subsidizing habits. We need to be there and watch for that. At the same time, what we might see is lower oil prices, leading some countries to support their producers of fossil fuels. That's a danger as well that we should be very watchful for. That being said, I would like to thank you very much for your time and attention, and we would be very happy to answer any questions you may have. Just to say that you can also access our database as of today following this web link here displayed on the bottom left corner of the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan.
Very much, Johan. This is terrific stuff. And also, let me, I made an omission in my presentation of who's doing what. Our Directorate of Trade and Agriculture sent me a message saying that they will wring my neck if I do not acknowledge the fact that they are very hard at work in this, and they are. They are, actually. They are. So I apologize for the omission. I was not trying to be inclusive. We normally try to be inclusive, but I was just trying to give you an idea of the flavor of the thing. And I was just looking at, I was listening to Johan and saying, my God, we should take this to New York, and we should send it to Mr. Hollande and to Mr. Fabius and to Madame Tobiana and everybody else here, you know. It's, this is big. No, this is really big, because these are very practical, tangible things. And as I said, just this cost twice the money we're trying to find. We should strongly incorporate this, Gabriela, in the diagnosis and the notes and the things we're trying to say. Just say, just fighting the war will get you. It's not often, you know, wars are very expensive to fight. But suddenly this is a war which, by fighting it, you can get the money to fight it. And there you fight it more, you get more money, you know. So you can beat the enemy. You can beat the enemy. By the time there's no more money generated, that means you don't need it anymore. It's a very attractive proposition. Anyway.
We're open to the questions now.
Comments, questions, or violent objections, please. Yes.
Rick Mitchell, BNA. The meeting of the finance ministers of I think it's the G20 are going to meet in Lima in the beginning of October. What will the OECD tell the finance ministers regarding what you've just said here? How they're desperately looking for ways to find this 100 billion, and France has said several times that if they don't find that money, that could sink the COP21 negotiations in December.
Yes.
So what could they do in October at this meeting of finance ministers? What could they do right now to make use of this information?
We're going to tell them the same thing we just told you. We're going to tell them exactly the same thing we just told you. But we may produce a few copies of that we're suggesting to you that you can link for the fundamental hardcore statistics that say where these 200 billion or the 160 billion, whatever, is coming from. And then the 800 ways in which we are misallocating these 200 billions. Only in the OECD countries, we had identified 250 ways in which our countries misallocate about maybe 90 billion or something like that. We've been doing that. We put out these scoreboards. It's a scoreboard of all the things we do wrong. So this has to be, as usual. First line of defense, efficiency. You use less of the stuff. Second, you put a big fat price on it, a big fat tax on it. Carbon is a common enemy, and by putting a price on it, you make it less desirable, but this is why the logic of dismantling the subsidies, and why we should eliminate this absolutely utter contradiction. And then go one by one by one by one, because not all of them are immediately doable. Not all of them are going to be for the benefit of society at large. But if it's for the benefit of the particular country that is going to stop subsidizing and can then do it, for their poor, that's fine. It doesn't have to be related to climate. Does this mean that we're going to suddenly find the 100 billion that we can put in a pot and dedicate it to the... No. But still, the international financial institutions, World Bank, the regional development banks, the export credit organization. By the way, some export credit institutions are no longer financing the COFACEs of this world. The French just announced that. The SACEs of Italy, the Hermes of Germany. But some of them are still doing it, some of them are not. Some of them are saying only high technology that produces less. Because basically, and I invite you to read my second conference at the LSE. The first one was almost 3 years ago, and there I said zero net emissions in the second half of the century. And it was very controversial, to say the least. Today, it is generally accepted truth. So we've made a lot of progress. I invite you to read the speech I delivered last month at the LSE, again, where basically the focus was on carbon, on think twice when you have a carbon plant. Coal that emits a lot of carbon. It's just that in Spanish you say carbón is coal. So we get carried away and we suddenly confuse the words, but it's coal. But also count once, twice, three times all the costs associated to a new coal plant, not just the actual cost of the coal and the hardware, because it's going to generate, bad air, bad water, bad earth, and bad, it's just going to be so damaging. And if you count all those externalities, then see if you still go for what apparently is cheaper, at least in the hardware. We've been very, very consistent with this. But the finance ministers, we're going to take the copies, we're going to tell them. But I also have to say that if you would leave it to the finance ministers today, at least to a very, very large majority of them, they would have done away with this because it's good for their budgets. So, look at finance ministers' motivations. Well, clearly, their budgets are a very important motivation for them. The environment minister has the motivation as keeping the climate, and the social affairs minister has a question of equality, but in the end, you put all these things together by doing this. This is the beauty. Part of the 200 billion will come out of this, sir. But as I said, it doesn't mean it's going to be there tomorrow and it's going to be available in a way which will, it's simply going to be better reallocation. And also, there's a particular problem. Most of the subsidies are in developing countries. That 100 billion have to be put together by developed countries. Except, it did not say the governments have to put it together. It said the private and the public sectors together. So think about, synergies, think about financial incentives, maybe even some tax incentives, financing for infrastructure, regulatory issues that will allow the mobilization of the resources. Because 100 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it is only part of the trillions that are required to really do the trick. So 100 billion is seed money to be able to stimulate developing countries, to help them do what is best for them, but also for the environment at large.
Further questions there? I think there's one right here.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Dominique Leman. I'm the French delegate to IEA and also to OECD, Mr. Secretary General. Je vais peut-être parler en français, ça sera plus facile pour moi. Je voudrais poser 3 questions. La première, c'est, je suppose que vous avez tous vu ce rapport au Fonds monétaire international qui parle des subventions aux combustibles fossiles et qui évalue ces subventions non pas à 500 milliards de dollars par an pour la production complète de combustibles fossiles dans le monde, mais à 5000 milliards de dollars par an, c'est-à-dire 10 fois plus que l'AIE. Et je m'excuse, je n'ai pas eu le temps de lire la brochure, mais c'est quand même intéressant de voir qu'il y a un écart considérable. Et cet écart, il est en fait basé sur ce qu'on appelle une subvention aux combustibles fossiles. Donc ça, c'est ma première question. Et une deuxième question, c'est, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, j'aimerais bien savoir comment vous pourriez caractériser le comportement, par exemple, de l'Iran par rapport à celui du Pakistan en ce qui concerne le pétrole. Le pétrole coûte 10 fois moins cher pour le consommateur iranien que pour le consommateur pakistanais. Et en un sens, ça pose le problème, puisque les Iraniens subventionnent-ils donc 10 fois plus que les Pakistanais leur pétrole? Et qu'est-ce que ça veut dire que subventionner le pétrole à partir du moment où l'Iran est un grand producteur de pétrole? Faut-il moralement, je dis bien, faut-il qu'il adopte une taxe sur le pétrole de façon à ce que les acheteurs de pétrole iraniens puissent payer leur pétrole, non pas au prix de production du pétrole qui est très inférieur aux coûts mondiaux du pétrole, mais au coût réel mondial. Voilà, c'est ça ma question. Est-ce que vous pensez que moralement, les États, tous les États, doivent adopter des taxes qui s'adaptent, des taxes qui s'adaptent au cours mondial du pétrole? Ceci pour le pétrole, mais vous voyez bien qu'il y a aussi, troisième question, il y a un cours mondial du pétrole qui correspond à un marché mondial. Mais il n'y a pas de marché mondial, ni du gaz, ni du charbon. Donc, je ne vois pas très bien comment on arrive à se sortir à sortir une définition claire d'une subvention à partir du moment où il n'y a pas de cours mondial. Voilà, je m'excuse, j'ai été un peu long.
Première question, j'avais évoqué pendant mon intervention qu'il y avait d'autres calculs qui se chiffraient dans les 1000 des milliards, etc., trillions, oui, mais que les bases sur lesquelles c'était calculé étaient avec... C'est quelque chose qui est très intéressant à suivre et à faire toute la logique arithmétique de calcul, mais ce que je dis, c'est que la logique avec laquelle nous avons calculé les 200 milliards, c'est beaucoup plus tangible, c'est touchable, c'est beaucoup plus compréhensible et vous pouvez le trouver dans les livres aujourd'hui, dans les budgets, vous pouvez le trouver dans les entreprises qui reçoivent, vous pouvez le trouver dans en effet, dans le panier de consommation d'un foyer typique pour tout, hein, de tous les pays qui font les bénéfices. Alors, je ne sais pas dire qu'un calcul ou l'autre est raté. Ce que je voudrais vous dire, c'est que même s'il y a quelqu'un qui dit que c'est 10 fois plus grand, pourquoi pas combattre au moins le plus petit, hein? C'est une très bonne manière de combattre. Et aussi, monsieur, parce que la consécution, la multiplication des calculs du Fonds monétaire international disparaît parce que la base du mal disparaît aussi quand il n'y a pas le bénéfice. Le subsidy, en français on dit la subvention. Si la subvention disparaît, tous les calculs qui se multiplient dans le temps et dans le secteur, etc., et ce télescope, hein, d'une manière très, très rapide, et disparaît parce que le ciment du mal disparaît aussi. Mais je dirais, si c'est des trillions, bon, il faut naturellement aller le faire demain. Mais pourquoi pas commencer avec le 200 milliards, qui c'est le double de ce qu'on a besoin? C'est ça, la logique n'est pas de dire qui a fait le bon calcul ou le mauvais calcul, mais seulement vous dire que nous avons le plus modeste des calculs et que le traditionnel chez le G20 toujours était 2,5 fois plus large que le nôtre aujourd'hui, mais aussi parce qu'il y a beaucoup de pays qui ont amélioré la situation. Hein. Ça veut dire aussi que les choses ont bougé, hein, ont bougé pour le mieux. Deuxièmement, vous parlez de morale. Je dirais, il y a l'éthique, il y a la moralité, il y a l'économie, et il y a aussi la responsabilité partagée, pas seulement pour les décisions de politique dans le territoire d'un pays spécifique, pour la population de ce pays spécifique, mais la responsabilité partagée pour les soucis de l'humanité, pour les pays qui, comme ils sont producteurs de la substance qui est l'origine des problèmes, comment on peut participer, partager et se corresponsabiliser. J'espère qu'une des bonnes conséquences de cette démarche diplomatique énormément importante qui ont fait les Européennes, les Américaines, et les Russes, etc., avec l'Iran, c'est précisément que l'Iran pourrait s'intégrer à les efforts de l'humanité entière. Et finalement, du point de vue technique, tu voudrais prendre la question du gaz et pétrole. Moi, j'ai mes propres idées, mais je voudrais que Johan vous donne la réponse. Oui.
Comme l'a dit le secrétaire général, notre inventaire est essentiellement un inventaire du coût budgétaire et fiscal des mesures. Donc nous ne faisons pas cet exercice de différentiel de prix et de prix de marché, c'est ce que fait l'AIE. Donc je ne vais pas parler au nom de l'AIE concernant leur méthodologie ou ce qu'ils font. Juste pointer du doigt le fait que ce que considère l'AIE en général est le coût d'opportunité d'exporter cette ressource. Donc ce n'est pas le coût marginal de production, mais c'est combien vendre à l'étranger, exporter un baril rapporterait au pays. Voilà, je ne vais pas en dire plus parce que c'est le rôle de l'AIE, mais encore une fois, insister que ce que nous couvrons ici, c'est vraiment ce qu'on trouve dans les budgets et dans les rapports des dépenses fiscales des différents pays, le coût aux contribuables des mesures.
Aussi, dans chaque pays, il y a un coût de gaz et un coût de charbon, un coût de pétrole. Il y a, si par exemple, ce pays, et même pays comme pays que vous avez évoqué, qu'aujourd'hui va être en possibilité d'exporter sa production. Naturellement, il y a des coûts d'opportunité. Hein. Ça veut dire que la référence devient plus souple. Quand on est avec des contraintes par les sanctions, et naturellement, c'était plus difficile d'avoir des références, mais c'est partout. Les Mexicains exportent, et il y avait une subvention à la consommation. La Venezuela, aujourd'hui, le coût fiscal est absolument énorme. Et il produit même un peu de contrebande frontalier parce que là, il y a une différence qui vaut la peine. Mais surtout, on développe une économie basée sur le prix, ou le prix très bas de l'énergie. Ça, c'est intéressant, c'est bien. Si on est doué de beaucoup d'énergie, je viens de rentrer de l'Islande, par exemple. J'utilise la géothermie, même pour produire des tomates. Hein. Mais la question, c'est que, naturellement, il y a un coût d'opportunité. Et le problème, c'est qu'ils sont des ressources réelles. Et le problème, c'est que dans tous les pays que vous avez évoqués et dans tous les autres, même les pays développés, il y a une population qui manque de meilleure qualité de l'eau, des routes, des autoroutes, des ports, des aéroports, logements, santé, éducation, etc. Alors, c'est une question d'allocation des priorités ou allocation prioritaire de ressources. Dans un moment, cher ami, dans lequel les contraintes budgétaires sont la règle. Je ne connais pas un seul ministre de Finances, vous avez évoqué le ministre de Finances, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? Je ne connais pas un seul ministre de Finances qui ne cherche pas les secrets, les grands secrets de leur propre budget, ou qui voudrait combattre les forces, comment est-ce qu'on dit, the factual forces, les forces qui combattent l'échange et qui se bénéficient aussi du status quo, hein, parce qu'ils sont puissantes. Ils sont puissantes précisément parce qu'ils sont accumulés des ressources au long des dizaines. On a, je ne sais pas si vous étiez déjà ici quand j'ai parlé qu'on parle des choses des 70, des années 70, de la crise énergétique des 70, de la crise des entreprises américaines des années 80. Et toujours, ils sont là. Ça veut dire que la rapidité avec l'industrie et le secteur productif exige déjà les producteurs de mer du Nord du Royaume-Uni demander et obtenu du gouvernement des appuis pour la situation avec les prix, parce que le coût d'extraire dans le North Sea, c'est haut. Mais ça veut dire, ça se fait très rapidement. Et vous savez, quand on les retire ou quand on les élève, jamais. Il y a une asymétrie. Hein? Il y a une asymétrie. La réponse politique ou des politiques n'est pas la même que quand il faut l'appui et on ne le retire pas. Et on n'a pas augmenté aussi les taxes considérablement pendant le temps de la bonanza. Bon. Oui, c'est fini?
I think we might have time for one more very quick question right
OK.
here.
Bonjour, Thomas Blosville, Environnement Magazine. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous préciser le poids de la France, de l'Union européenne dans ses soutiens aux combustibles fossiles et les marges de manœuvre par rapport au volume global que vous avez identifié? Merci.
Bonjour, merci pour votre question. Dans le cadre de l'inventaire, en général, nous ne comparons pas les pays les uns par rapport aux autres, parce qu'on parle beaucoup de dépenses fiscales, de concessions fiscales, ce qui fait que c'est des données qui ne sont pas forcément comparables en montant absolu entre pays. Par exemple, les taxes en Suède sur le carburant vont être très différentes des taxes aux États-Unis, ce qui fait que toute déviation par rapport à ce niveau normal de taxes va conduire à des montants pas comparables entre pays. Donc c'est dur de juger et dire ce pays-là est un mauvais élève, celui-ci est un bon élève, on ne pointe pas du doigt. Donc voilà, pour le contexte français, c'est un peu difficile d'émettre un jugement strict là-dessus. Maintenant, votre question concernait, il y avait un second point, je crois, dans la question, non? Il y avait la place de la France et au niveau européen.
C'était la France au moins l'Union européenne.
Dans son ensemble.
Ouais, non, mais par exemple, tu as mentionné Suède. En Suède, je crois qu'aujourd'hui, le taxe par tonne de dioxyde de carbone évité est de 100 euros. 100. 100 euros. Imaginez-vous que le mécanisme d'enchère des droits pour la pollution et dans le côté européen, première chose, c'est la 3e fois ou 4e fois qu'on essaye de lancer. Pas encore, pas de succès. Il a produit des montants énormément modestes. Parce que c'était lancé pendant une période de récession. On était en train de réduire les émissions de toute façon. Et en même temps, comme on a surémis, on a émis trop de permis, naturellement, le prix a tombé. C'est supply and demand, l'offre de la demande. Il y avait beaucoup d'offres de permis et ça tombait. Alors, en tant que la Suède n'entend pas au système européen, etc., il met en taxe. Alors, je demandais toujours, et aussi dans mes conférences dans London School of Economics, je disais, pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne fait pas les choses simples? Si on veut mettre un prix sur le carbone, sur le charbon, sur le coal, sur les émissions, pourquoi ne pas mettre en taxe? Il dit, la raison, c'est totalement politique. Politiquement, un taxe additionnelle, c'est très difficile à vendre, à passer, à prouver, à convaincre, etc. En tant que l'autre semble, c'est un taxe. Mais le problème, c'est que l'autre, c'est un mécanisme qui ne produit pas les résultats qu'on cherche, que c'est de changer la conduite, changer la manière de produire, changer la manière de conduire, changer la manière de vivre dans les foyers, etc. Si on ne met pas un prix puissant, ça ne fonctionne pas. Alors, même ça, comment est-ce qu'on arrive à la même chose avec laquelle nous sommes tous d'accord? Le prix. Comment mettre un prix? Tout le monde est d'accord. Un prix. Mais il y a des mécanismes qui ont déjà échoué. Et des mécanismes qui vont très bien. Est-ce que la Suède a perdu compétitivité à cause de ça? Non. Il n'y a pas une seule compagnie suède qui dit « je ne peux pas vendre mes produits à cause ou mes services, à cause du taxe sur ce qu'ils ont fait, c'est réduire la consommation, etc. » Et bon, écoute, merci énormément à toutes et à tous. Aidez-nous. à transmettre le message. Aidez-nous à partager le message. Ces vérités qu'on vient de partager avec vous ne sont pas évidentes pour tout le monde. Et il y a une dissonance cognitive ou cognoscitive. Je ne sais pas comment est-ce qu'on dit en français. Une dissonance cognitive, ça veut dire qu'on ne veut pas, on n'écoute pas ce qu'on ne veut pas écouter. Hein? On est sourd pour les choses qu'on n'aime pas écouter. Et il faut les mettre par écrit, il faut les mettre en télé, il faut les mettre dans les journaux, il faut les mettre dans les magazines, il faut les mettre dans les discussions de politique, il faut les mettre partout. Et comme ça, la dissonance cognitive, peut-être, on va la vaincre. Merci.
Thank you, Secretary General. We'll bring this news conference to a close now. For the journalists in the room, if you'd like technical discussion with Johan, he's here. Just please come up to the front. Thank you.